Welcome back. In this third part, we'll move on and think about some of the practicalities involved with teaching and assessing debate. So I'm going to say just three things really in this section. Something about steps you might take to prepare for the debate, something about what you might do when you're teaching through debate, and then finally say something about how you might assess this process. So in terms of preparing, there are several activities you might employ when you're leading up to a debate. So some activities that have been developed by the English Speaking Union, which exists to promote debating competitions and debate in schools. They use the rebuttal game, which is very simple. You put children in small groups, you give them very simple phrases like the sky is blue, and then they have to quickly say, I couldn't disagree more because, and give a not ridiculous, but maybe not wholly convincing, but speedy response. So if someone says, the sky is blue, you could say, I couldn't disagree more, on stormy days it's grey. Or first thing in the morning, it's often orange. So you have to find a way to think on your feet. Children enjoy this game, but it gets them in the habit of responding quickly, which is one of the skills that you have to have, especially if you're in a formal competitive debate and you've only got 3 minutes and you're being timed. And you need to be able to respond as quickly as possible. So that's a good way to get kids thinking on their feet and get them used to fast responses. Conscience Alley is where you practice trying to convince people and you get immediate feedback on how convincing your argument is. So you take all of the students in the classroom, you line them up facing each other, so each half faces the other half, so that you've got pairs facing one another, and then another student starts at the beginning of the conscience alley and walks through the space in between them, and children take it in turns to either give someone an argument for or against the motion, and if the child in between is convinced by the strength of the argument, they move closer towards the child who's made the argument. If they're not convinced, they think it's a weak argument, they move further towards the other side. And this is a nice fun way for children to get immediate feedback on whether their argument is more or less convincing than other people's. In the condensing machine, you're encouraging children here to make succinct, focused speeches. So the condensing machine, you ask someone to tell a story in 2 minutes. It might just be the story of what they did yesterday. And then the next person in the group has to retell that story in 1 minute. And then the next person has to tell it in 30 seconds. Then 15 seconds, then 10 seconds, and possibly even 5 seconds. And the whole point of this is to help children practice identifying the most important points and cutting out the excess detail. And this helps them be really clear in the way they structure their communication in a debate. And then finally, the English Speaking Union used to talk about making a sexy argument, which is just to give children a structure, that there's a statement, there's an explanation, and an illustration. So you start off by stating what you think, you then explain the reasoning behind you coming to that conclusion, and then you give an illustration. So we might start off in the example we've been using. I think Gandhi was naive in his approach to partition. My explanation would be because he failed to recognise how committed Jinnah was to the idea of participation and didn't get fully involved in the debate until it was too late. An illustration, he himself was killed as a result of communal violence, which he didn't foresee. So giving children this as a kind of checking point enables them to make sure that each of the points they're making is fully rounded and that they're being explicit about the reasoning that they're employing in order to support their statement. This is really important with younger children who sometimes just state what they think and forget to provide you with all the logical steps that lead you to share their conclusion. So activities like this build student confidence and competence in debating skills, and you disaggregate the skills so you can teach them one by one. Then when they come to have the real debate, they've got that experience of success in each of these individual aspects to draw on. So the picture of the boy at the top shows you how you might kind of structure this, that if you're planning a formal debate, it's really important that every speaker has at least 2 or 3 substantive points they're going to make, and that you have to organise your thinking so that you've got 2 or 3 really powerful and separate points that you can make. You can't just keep going on and repeating in slightly different ways the same arguments. So it's a useful teaching sequence to get at the point where you have these arguments developed. So you can choose a topic and write the motion with the children, or you can just set the motion that fits in with your scheme of work. You then split participants into for and against groups. They then brainstorm all of the relevant arguments and points of view for and against. In this little diagram, we're brainstorming on post-its. Then you cluster all of the points together so that you have conceptual themes. And then you can split the themes between speakers. And then each speaker knows what points, the themes and the examples they're using in their speech. Then they can prepare their notes, prepare their speeches, and then they can engage with the debate. So typically this kind of activity would take at least 30 or 40 minutes to prepare the children, and in order to do the brainstorm they'd already have to be prepared in terms of understanding the topic. So you can see that these preparatory stages may well take a few lessons to build up to, but it's worth it if you want to get the most out of the debate lesson. The other thing you need to think about in these preparatory stages is what kind of evidence or what kind of guidance you're going to give them. So you need to think about the selection of sources, you need to think about how you're going to give them ideas for arguments. You could give them possible arguments, you could give them sentence starters, you could give them examples of arguments used historically that they could draw on. You need to think about how much information you're going to give them about the roles they're adopting, and you need to think about prompts. So you might give them questions, for example, and the answer to their questions will be the beginning of their speeches. So the second thing you need to think about is kind of what you're going to do as a teacher during this debate. Now the worst debates are where the teacher is essentially being the puppeteer. They give the children so much guidance and they control what they do to such an extent that it is essentially children rehearsing lines given them by the teacher. So we want to avoid that. And Doug Harwood gives us a number of different roles that we can adopt in the classroom that fall short of this kind of controlling everything that's going on. So he says sometimes teachers might be a participant and argue as part of the debate and put themselves on one side. Other times we might be devil's advocates, so we might just see how the debate's going and then intervene where we feel there is the greatest need to balance out the argument. So if we're having a free discussion and everyone seems to agree with the proposition, the teacher's role might be to disagree, whatever they really think, just to help the children see there's a counter argument that could be developed. We could be the impartial facilitator, where we don't talk about any of the arguments themselves, but we just encourage the children to take turns and to talk in coherent ways. We could be the instructor, where we intervene and ask questions, or give people more precise instructions so that they do better in the debate. Or we could be the committed instructor, which is that we do those things, but we also make it clear where we stand, and we might intervene if we think someone is being rude about the opposition, or we might make it clear where we stand, that we think it was a good thing that Indian partition happened, and give our reasons as part of that. We might be an interviewer in the classroom, and if we feel weaker students aren't giving us very good speeches, then we will come up with questions to draw their argument out of them to make their speeches better. We might simply be an observer and then pass comments periodically about what the next speakers might do to avoid falling into the problems that earlier speakers fell into. Or we might be an absent leader, which is just to specify exactly how the debate's going to happen and then withdraw, so that it all happens on very predictable lines, but our actual involvement in steering things is very minimal. One of the important things, if we're doing a formal debate, is to be clear about the timing and the pace. So here's an example of a timeline taken from a magazine that was published recently of guidance for teachers, where you can see how long this would take. This is based on having a formal competitive debate where each of the speakers has 3 minutes. Each of the first 2 speakers has 3 minutes, and then the summary speaker has 2 minutes. And there's a very short time, just 5 minutes in this model, for a floor debate for members of the audience to speak. But you can see here that going through the whole process of opposition and proposition would take 25 minutes. So it's really important that you think clearly, if you're going to have a whole sequence of speeches, how much time do you need, and making sure that you manage that time crisply and clearly. Otherwise these lessons can very often kind of spin out of control, and it's very frustrating if children are prepared not to have time to make their speeches. The other thing we can do about timing is to make sure we keep the pace of the lesson going. The younger students, in my experience teaching this with the bottom age group, so 11 to 13, 14-year-olds in post-primary secondary schools, younger students often respond very well to this constant encouragement and an immediate recognition of what they're doing well. So you can manipulate that slightly by keeping a public score. So I would always keep a marking board like this to one side of the classroom, or just use the chalkboard at the front. If there's a for and against team, then I'd keep this kind of running list, running commentary going, really, by giving children a point every time they made a contribution. So they get a point just for speaking in public, because some people find that difficult. For every time they respond to another point, so every time they issue a rebuttal from a member of the opposition, they get a point just from having the confidence to do that. And then every time they make a new point that hasn't yet been heard in the debate. Now these three things are great because they happen very often, which means you can give lots and lots of points. So my experience of working with younger children is this stops them from losing focus and keeps them really focused on the activity at hand, because they love earning points and they love to see who's ahead of the game. Now this doesn't mean that the winner is the team with more points, but you can give a small reward for this, because this means that these were the team that performed the best in terms of everyone contributing and everyone contributing something new. But when we come to assessment, we're going to make some more nuanced decisions. So there are different sources of evidence for our assessment. First of all, we've got work completed in those preparatory phases. We might have research that's conducted by the teams. We might have notes they made. We might have full speeches they prepared, so we can mark that work. We can also mark the actual contribution to the debate. So we can sit in the classroom and listen to speeches. We can hear how well children ask and respond to questions, and they give their responses. That's quality work, and we can mark that by keeping a note in our own notebook as we go through. So this work doesn't have to subsequently be written up for us to recognise the value of the work. But then often it is written up afterwards in some shape or form. We might ask children to write a reflection of the debate. We might ask them to write a newspaper report providing a summary of all sides of the debate. We might ask them to write a personal response, what they think of the outcome of the debate is and what they now think their personal position is. So at each stage we can generate different bits of work that give us a glimpse as to how well the students have engaged and understood. We also need to think about the balance. So we can use teacher assessment to collect in the work, to listen to the work and then judge it. We can also build an element of self-assessment. We can ask children to write down what they learned, how they think they've improved, what they've done to improve, and whether they think that paid off. And we can build in peer assessment. A big part of debating is to convince other people. So it makes sense to ask the other people in the audience how convincing they found their peers and to give them feedback on what they could do to improve next time. And then we also need to think about the balance of assessment judgments between history knowledge. So how are we going to give them some acknowledgement in our marking for how well they recalled and used information, between history arguments, how well they construct an argument, and the generic debate performance as well. Some children are just very good at thinking on their feet and arguing with charm and humour, but their historical knowledge might be a bit thin, whereas others might be very much better at understanding the history, but just be less polished in the performance. So it's important to disaggregate those different themes and make sure we give feedback accurately on each of them. Now there are different ways that we might construct criteria. I've always liked this. This isn't designed for school teachers, but Steiner et al. Wrote a book where they were looking at the quality of parliamentary debate in different parliamentary institutions. And they scored parliamentarian speeches according to these 7 criteria. But it seems to me these are very similar to the criteria we might develop in school. So they gave each speech or speaker scores for levels of participation. Then the levels of justification they gave, to what extent do they bother to justify their position rather than just state it, and then the content of their justification, to what extent is their justification inclusive, does it acknowledge there are different perspectives being taken on this issue, to what extent do they give reasoned arguments that other people can listen to and engage with. And then the other characteristics of good democratic debating are respect towards people affected by the issue, and then respect for the position adopted by other participants in the debate, and then their ability to respond to the counter-arguments, that rebuttal skill, and then overall their ability to provide a constructive response to the debate. So we could imagine giving children feedback on one, two, or all of these kinds of characteristics, or indeed asking children in the audience to give people feedback on how well they think they did against these headings. And then there are some simple methods for keeping track of this. This is a mark sheet that was designed by the English Speaking Union, and I've put the reference at the bottom of the page there. Each speaker in a debate could have this as their kind of their marking grid, so you make a quick note on arguments made to remind you of what they've said. But along the bottom, you're giving them a score for their reasoning and evidence, for their organisation and prioritisation of the points, for their listening and their responses, and for their expression and delivery. So you can see here that you've got a couple reasoning and evidence, which is where you give some recognition of the history. Organisation and prioritisation might be about those history skills of understanding significance and how to construct an argument. And then the listening and response and expression and delivery are more the generic communication skills. But it adds up, it's weighted towards the history scores, but it adds up to comparable scores that children could use to judge their performance against others. So here are some of the references I've drawn on in this part of the lecture. I think the important thing that I wanted to communicate is this: that you do need to think about setting up these activities in advance, and then you need to think carefully about how you're going to collect evidence along the way as part of this extended process that you can use to inform your judgments. So the task I'm asking you to do this week is simply to have a go, to plan and use a debate, and then write up your reflections about how effectively it went and how well you think it promoted some historical reasoning among the children in your class. So good luck with that, and I look forward to reading your comments in the next week or so.